It was a night that began like any other in the golden glow of Studio 6B, that legendary stage where laughter was currency and Johnny Carson was king. The band played its familiar jazz riff, Doc Severinsen's trumpet gleamed under the lights, and America's favorite late-night host stepped through the curtain with his usual effortless stride. The applause roared, 1,000 hands clapping as if to say, "All is right with the world." It was 1977, a time before viral clips and instant fame, when live television still felt electric, fragile, even, and Carson ruled it like a magician who never revealed his tricks. Millions of Americans ended their days with him, trusting that whatever chaos filled their daylight hours would dissolve into comfort by the time his monologue began. Yet behind that reassuring smile was a man who understood the weight of that expectation. A man who had lived through heartbreak, divorces, sleepless nights, and the loneliness that fame so often hides. Beneath the jokes, Johnny Carson was a quiet observer of people, a man who noticed what others missed. And on that ordinary Thursday night, in the middle of what should have been just another perfectly timed episode, something extraordinary unfolded. Something that would remind America that the brightest lights in television sometimes shine on the darkest corners of humanity. The show was running smoothly. Carson had just wrapped an interview with a rising young actor and was shuffling his cue cards, preparing for a quick comedy bit before the musical guest. The audience laughed, the orchestra hummed, and everything in the control room ticked along like a well-oiled clock. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a ripple of confusion stirred. A man had appeared in one of the aisles, thin, gray-haired, clutching a crumpled hat in trembling hands. His clothes hung loose, dusty, a patchwork of wear and survival. At first, no one reacted. Studio staff assumed he was a late-arriving audience member. But as he stepped farther forward, closer to the stage, it became clear he wasn't supposed to be there. He looked lost, exhausted, and utterly out of place in the glitter of show business. Security began to move, discreetly but firmly, and that's when Johnny noticed him. Carson's eyes, trained by years of reading crowds and catching the smallest flicker of energy, locked onto the stranger. Something about him, maybe the way he clutched his hat, maybe the weary look that spoke of too many nights outdoors, made Johnny pause. The studio lights burned bright and hot, but what filled the room next wasn't laughter, it was uncertainty. The guards reached the man just as he stopped near the stage steps. The cameras were still rolling. Carson raised his hand, signaling them to halt. His voice, calm and steady, echoed across the studio. "It's all right. Let him be." The laughter died instantly. The band went silent. Everyone, crew, audience, even Carson's longtime producer Freddie de Cordova froze. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the studio equipment. And then, breaking the tension, Carson said softly, "Hey friend, come on up here." The man hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to pull him away. But Carson nodded reassuringly. "Come on," he said again. "We've got room for one more." The audience, unsure whether this was a bit or a breakdown, murmured nervously. The man slowly stepped onto the stage. Carson walked toward him, an unthinkable move for a host who almost never left his desk during the show. Up close, the man's story was written on his face. The sunken eyes, the stubble, the skin weathered by years without shelter. "What's your name?" Carson asked, microphone in hand. The man swallowed hard. "Jim?" he said quietly. "Just Jim." Carson smiled gently. "Well, Jim, it's good to meet you." The crowd offered polite applause, unsure how to react. "You from around here?" Carson continued. Jim nodded. "Used to be. Played music once. Got off track." His words trailed off. Carson tilted his head. "Music, huh? What kind?" "Jazz," Jim said, his voice gaining a hint of pride. "Trumpet." The band stirred. Doc Severinsen looked up from his horn, eyebrows raised. Carson's instincts kicked in. "Doc," he said, turning to his bandleader, "how about you let this man show us what he's got?" The audience gasped. Surely he was joking, but Doc nodded and handed Jim his spare trumpet. Jim turned it in his hands like an artifact from another life. He hesitated, took a breath, and played a slow, trembling note. The sound wasn't perfect. It cracked, wavered, but it was soulful, aching, human. By the time he finished a short, improvised blues phrase, the audience was on its feet. Carson clapped along, grinning. "Ladies and gentlemen, that right there," he said, pointing at Jim, "is why we do this show. You never know who's going to walk through that door." The room erupted in applause, not the canned variety that filled every broadcast, but the genuine, teary-eyed kind that no one could fake. Backstage, however, NBC executives were in panic mode. This wasn't in the script. A homeless man on national television? What if something went wrong? What if sponsors complained? But Carson didn't care. He invited Jim to sit in the guest chair. Yes, that chair where presidents and movie stars had perched. Jim sat gingerly, eyes darting toward the cameras. Carson leaned in. "So, tell me, Jim," he said, "how'd you end up here tonight?" Jim took a shaky breath and said, "I just wanted to see the show. Been sleeping near the studio. Thought maybe if I could hear some laughter again." His voice broke. The audience went silent. Carson reached across the desk, resting a hand on the man's arm. "Well," he said softly, "you brought us more than laughter tonight." The next few minutes unfolded like something out of a dream. Carson spoke with Jim about music, about hard times, about how life can change overnight. He never once made a joke at Jim's expense. There was no irony, no mockery, only respect. For once, television wasn't trying to entertain, it was trying to understand. NBC's control room begged for a commercial break, but Carson waved them off. "No cuts," he mouthed. When they finally did fade to break, the audience rose to its feet again, clapping long after the lights dimmed. After the show, Johnny took Jim backstage. Crew members offered him food and a warm drink. Carson called a local shelter personally, arranging a bed and promising to check in. He handed Jim an envelope quietly, some cash. "No cameras, no press release. Just get yourself a fresh start," he said. Jim tried to speak but couldn't. He simply hugged Carson, tears streaming down his face. The next morning, news outlets buzzed with headlines. "Carson stops. Show for stranger. Tonight Show host shares stage with homeless musician," and Late Night turns human. Viewers wrote thousands of letters, so many that NBC mail clerks had to store them in boxes. Some shared their own stories of homelessness. Others thanked Carson for reminding the world that compassion still existed. One letter read simply, "Last night, Johnny made us proud to be human again." NBC executives were initially nervous, worried sponsors might view the episode as too serious, but the public reaction was overwhelming. Ratings spiked the next week. Carson said nothing about it on air. He never mentioned Jim again publicly. When a reporter tried to press him, he shrugged and said he didn't need a headline. He needed a hand. Those 9 words became legend in the halls of NBC. Crew members began referring to that night as the Jacket Show, because Carson had given Jim his blazer right there on camera, a symbol that even the smallest gesture could warm the coldest night. What happened to Jim afterward remains partly mystery, partly miracle. Several months later, a local paper ran a small story about a man named Jim Harper, a trumpet player who'd been homeless and was now volunteering with a community music program. The reporter claimed he had once appeared on television, but wouldn't say more. When asked about Carson, Jim reportedly smiled and said, "He gave me more than a handout. He gave me a moment to feel like I mattered again." That line captured the soul of what happened that night. It wasn't charity, it was dignity. For Carson, that evening became a quiet turning point. Colleagues noticed he grew a little gentler with guests after that, a little slower to rush a punchline. He had always understood timing, but now he seemed to understand silence even more. He once told his head writer, "People don't tune in for jokes, they tune in for connection." That insight reshaped Late Night television for years to come. From then on, he occasionally broke format, not often, but when it mattered. A surprise reunion, a heartfelt farewell, a moment of vulnerability, all drawn from the same well of empathy he'd shown that night. Historians of television often talk about ratings, cultural shifts, and competition, but what Carson did that evening transcended all of it. It wasn't planned, it wasn't polished, and that's why it mattered. In a world built on illusion, authenticity is the rarest currency. For 10 unfiltered minutes, America saw the real Johnny Carson, not the charming host, but the man who believed laughter and kindness could coexist. He turned live television into a sermon on decency, delivered not with words, but with action. And decades later, when people talk about the golden age of TV, that story still circulates, part truth, part legend, but wholly unforgettable. In the years that followed, Carson's career continued to soar, but every now and then, someone in the industry would bring up the night he stopped his show. Comedians, talk show hosts, and journalists all referred to it as proof that compassion could be contagious. When David Letterman launched his own show, he cited Carson's empathy as his greatest influence. Jay Leno once said privately, "That's the bar Johnny set, not just the laughter, but the heart." Even modern hosts like Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert have mentioned the story as a defining example of the humanity behind the stage lights. Carson himself never took credit. In later interviews, when asked why audiences connected so deeply with him, he said, "Maybe because I never pretended to be better than them." That humility was his secret weapon. The Night with Jim revealed it for all to see. He could have ignored the man, cut to commercial, and no one would have questioned him. But instead, he did the opposite. He used the world's biggest stage to remind viewers that compassion isn't a weakness, it's a responsibility. When Johnny retired in 1992, ending 3 decades of The Tonight Show, fans flooded NBC with letters again, many referencing that night from 15 years earlier. Some called it the moment they realized Carson wasn't just a host, he was a mirror for the best parts of ourselves. In his final broadcast, Carson didn't mention the event directly, but when he closed with, "I bid you a very heartfelt good night," a few in the audience swore they saw him glance briefly toward the corner of the stage where Jim had once stood. In the quiet years that followed his retirement, Carson rarely appeared in public. Yet those who knew him best said he remained proudest of the unscripted moments, the times when the laughter gave way to truth. A friend recalled visiting Carson in his later years and finding, framed on his bookshelf, a faded black and white photo of that night. Carson on stage, his jacket draped around Jim's shoulders, both men smiling. Beneath the glare of the studio lights, no autograph, no caption, just a memory of kindness frozen in time. The story of Johnny Carson and the homeless man endures not because it was glamorous or dramatic, but because it was profoundly simple. It reminded people that decency doesn't have to be grand to be great. It can live in a quiet moment, in the space between a question and an answer, in a host's decision to see a person instead of a problem. It's a story retold by those who never tire of believing that even at the height of fame, empathy can still cut through the noise. So when we talk about Johnny Carson, the laughter, the monologues, the decades of joy, we should also remember that one night when he put all of it on hold, the cameras kept rolling, the lights stayed bright, but for a brief, miraculous few minutes, television stopped pretending and started caring. That's the night Johnny Carson stopped The Tonight Show, and in doing so, reminded the world that even in a room built for laughter, compassion can leave the loudest echo of all.